5 seconds to submergence. Submergence deep into the absurd.
The Absurd, episode number 27, with Dr. K. Brad Wray. He is a professor of philosophy at Aarhus University. Did I say that right that time?
Yes, you did.
All right, good. So that's in Denmark.
Yes, it is.
So what's it like living there?
It's great. Yeah, it's a change. I'm a Canadian citizen, but I lived in the United States for 15 years.
All right.
So, and then I've been here in Denmark since 2017.
Did you study philosophy in the United States?
No, I studied philosophy in Canada. So I did my bachelor's degree at the University of Toronto and did my MA and PhD at the University of Western Ontario.
All right. That's awesome. So what got you into all that? What made you decide, okay, I love philosophy, I want to start studying this, I want to be a philosopher?
Okay, after high school, I originally went to an art college, so Ontario College of Art, which is in Toronto, and I studied graphic design, and I started a career in graphic design. And one of the things I was struck by was how volatile the business is now. Unstable a career is. So I was seeking something more secure than graphic design. So I thought perhaps philosophy. I was just studying part-time and was ready just for a change. So yeah, and I find philosophical questions interesting.
So do I. I guess that's why we're both here, right?
I guess.
Cool. So I was looking through your research, and I have a few questions for you, and then feel free to go on a tangent if you'd like.
Okay.
So you kind of study epistemology, and one thing that you do with that in the philosophy of science is there's this thing called the Anti-Realism debate, and I want to know what that is.
Okay, that's a good question. There's actually many debates. I'll walk you through a bit of the history, and starting with there was a debate of sorts involving astronomers around Copernicus's time about whether the aims of astronomy are merely to generate models, planetary models for predictive purposes. So it's an instrumentalist view, which would be classified as anti-realist, or whether the aims of astronomy are cosmological, like, you should be aiming to describe the cosmos as they really are. And so that was a debate, one version of the realism, anti-realism debate. And it surfaced again, a similar debate around 1900 between Max Planck and Ernst Mach about the reality of atoms, whether we have reason to believe atoms are real or whether they're just convenient theoretical entities, posits, to aid us in our reasoning. Then in the 60s, early 60s, late 50s, philosophers got engaged in the realism, anti-realism debate. And that debate concerned how to understand theoretical language. The realists were arguing that we should interpret theoretical language literally. That is, the purpose of our theoretical language is to describe the world, the unobservable aspects of the world as they really are. Whereas the anti-realist is alleged to say that the theoretical vocabulary can be reduced or to claims about observables. It's not clear any philosopher held that view. it was a view attributed to scientists, in particular people associated with the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics. Now, the contemporary debate that I'm engaged in really began around 1980, late 70s, 1980. 1980 is a good date to pick because that was the year when Van Frossen published Scientific Image, which revitalized anti-realism. It was his constructive empiricism was a first vigorous attempt to advance an anti-realist position. And then in 81, Larry Loudon published a very important paper, The Confutation of Convergent Realism, where he, in a sense, challenges claims or the inferences realists make from the success of science to either the truth of our theoretical claims, our claims about unobservables, or claims of reference that the theoretical posits that talk about the theoretical posits, the unobservables, are as our theories say they are. So he challenged these claims where realists make an inference from the success of science to some sort of realistic interpretation of these claims. Now, the way I understand the realist, anti-realist debate, or I guess one of the things I'm recommending is that we should understand what divides realist and anti-realist now is whether the anti-realist is saying we should expect future developments in science to involve accepting theories that are fundamentally different than the theories we currently accept. That is, that describe, that posit the existence of things that are fundamentally different from the sorts of things that are posited by the theories we currently accept. Now, the realist is denying that. They're more or less claiming that changes in science would be modifications of our current understanding, rather than a fundamentally different sort of vision of reality. So that's the realism, anti-realism debate today, I guess. Yeah.
So it seems to me that the anti-realists are a little bit more realistic.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, I think what they are is attuned to in a sense, the developments of in the history of science. There's a long history of science that supports this idea that no matter how good we feel about our theories, or no matter how confident we feel about them, they're prone to be overthrown in the future. Now, I don't think the anti-realists should just base their anti-realist position on this historical type of argument. I also think there's logical considerations. And this is most pointedly put by Van Frossen with the argument from the bad lot, which basically draws attention to the fact that when we make an inference to the truth or likely truth or approximate truth of our current theories on the basis of predictive and explanatory successes, what we're failing to do is take into account the fact that, like, we're merely choosing the best of the theories we've got so far, the best of the ones we've developed. And what Van Frossen raises is the possibility that we might be choosing the best of the bad lot. That is to say, we might be choosing from a set of theories that doesn't contain the true theory in it. This is always going to be hanging over us. And this is not just some sort of logical possibility. In fact, this is what we learned from Carl Stanford's argument, the new argument from unconceived alternatives. And we should just realize that we only ever consider those theories that have been developed to date. And that's a very restricted set. It's just, on reflection, we should all realize that. And usually scientists are really choosing between one or two, or possibly or two or three, or possibly four well-developed alternatives. So they're really choosing from a very small set of possible theories. And this warrants a certain skeptical attitude. So are you convinced now?
Yes. I think I'm definitely on the anti-realist side. However, I do know that science, although it might not be accurate conceptually, it is for the most part accurate on a practical basis. So far as we have computers and cars, and there's certain things that we learn from science that allow us to build these things and at least interact with the world, but they're not true on a conceptual basis.
No, and the anti-realist does not deny the extreme success of science with respect to our understanding of observables or the phenomena. So, and they don't deny that we're making advances, but what they're trying to draw to people's attention is that these developments in our knowledge there are not tied in a systematic way to developments in our theoretical understanding. And even though theory may open up new avenues for us, it's not clear it warrants us drawing the conclusion that what our current theory tells us about reality is sort of the final story on it. And we should expect, as I said at the beginning, that our current theoretical understanding will be overturned by a theoretical understanding that gives us a fundamentally different picture of reality.
You know, I'm not religious, and generally I look at the Big Bang Theory and I'm like, okay, you know, that makes sense. But as I've gotten older, I'm thinking, okay, well, let's think. What all could happen in 13 billion years that could make us now on this point, on this speck, this rock, to think that is really the case, right? I mean, in 100 years from now, they're probably going to come up with something else.
Yeah, it's possible. And again, a lot of these issues, personally, I won't weigh in on because I just don't know enough of the science. But it certainly warrants skepticism on my part, or at least, and by skepticism, I just mean that not the denying that it's true, but the withholding judgment. The withholding judgment. And it may very well warrant withholding judgment on the part of the scientists who are more aware of the data. But I sort of avoid weighing in on particular scientific controversies unless I've read a fair bit about them.
Yes.
Because I think philosophers in particular, philosophers, because many of them yearn to talk about these things, I think they get overconfident about such claims. I had an exchange in the book symposium on my book that was published in Metascience with Peter Vickers, and Peter Vickers gives these examples about talking about our knowing the structure of the center of the earth. And you know, in the past few years, there's been numerous articles in Science, the journal Science, that with titles implying we're learning something new and fundamentally different about what we thought about the center of the earth. Like, you know, so I just think these things are far less settled than people like to think. And so this warrants a certain anti-realist attitude.
That's because they're unobservable.
Yes.
And with that said, I mean, there's lots of things that are going to continue being unobservable because we just don't have the tools necessary to observe them.
Yeah.
We can't travel back in time 13 billion years to see the Big Bang, right? Or we can't, go to the center of the Earth. And if we did go to the center of the Earth, what if, because we went there, it changed?
Yes. No. These are the types of considerations that play into, that support an anti-realist stance in science, in philosophy of science and science. Yeah.
So that kind of brings me to my next question. I know you're not a biologist, but that's kind of irrelevant here. We're just speculating. So, do you think humans could ever develop the tools to see all the unobservables? Or do you think there's going to be a limit to our technological advancements, a limit to our biology? Because there's this analogy of, say, the slug, right? The slug's rolling along its way, and then the human waves its hand in front of the slug, and the slug just keeps going. It doesn't even notice us, right? So there might be organisms out there that could be doing that to us, right? They could be waving our hand, or their hand, in air quotes, in front of us, and we don't even know it, right? So
we're all slugs. I follow you, and I think and we're all slugs. I have a view of theories insofar as insofar as I have a view of theories. What I think theories are partial representations. So, and what that means is they only get at some things and not others. That's what makes them useful, that they focus our attention on some things, and then we block out many other things. So I think it was Klein talked about the torrential sensory input we have from the world. It's overwhelming. We have to cut through it all. And the way we do that is sort of narrow our vision. And that's what theories are good at doing. They focus our attention on some salient features and lead us to disregard others. Now, the price we pay for that is that our understanding that we develop, our theoretical understanding, is only going to be a partial representation because it's cut out all those things. But that's a trade-off we have to make. To sort of understand the world, we have to set limits to what we're going to aim at. And in that sense, I think, to come back to your picture, we're forcing ourselves, in a sense, to be a slug of a certain sort. So there's no other way to proceed. So this is why we should expect every theory to sort of run its course, because at one point we're going to be asking questions with the tools, the conceptual tools provided by the theory, that exceed its abilities. And then we're going to be ready to move on to a new theory.
So it's a sort of scientific evolution.
In a way, yeah, in a way. Mm-hmm. Push from behind.
Yes, because the strongest theories survive, and then those theories then lead to us developing better ones over time. I mean, guess maybe not better, but different and perhaps better. I'm not sure.
Yeah. One way they're better is, like, in one way we obviously change the world profoundly with advances in science. I mean, the examples you gave earlier, the technological advancements, we're making a new world when we live with new technologies. Like, even this technology we're using now, it wasn't a reality in the 1920s. So we're living in a different world as a result. But knowledge of observables is sort of amassing. Now, we lose some along the way. That is, we forget some, but we seem to be making progress there, but it is not, it doesn't bring with it, or it's not accompanied by an advance in theoretical understanding.
So you wrote this paper. It's how is a revolutionary scientific paper cited the case of Hess's history of the ocean basins.
Yeah.
So what was that about?
Okay, it's a foundational paper in the plate tectonics revolution. It was written in the early 60s. I think it was 63, 62. And what I wanted to do was examine the citation patterns to this paper as an example of a paper that contributed to a revolution. In part because a geologist, Menard, had written who was a contemporary of Hess's, had written a book chapter where he suggested that, and he was writing in the early 70s, that he expects that Hess's paper will be cited like other papers. And there's a good, like a sort of well-cited paper in the sciences, increases in citations and peaks, usually between 5 and 10 years after it's published, and then the citations to it just drop off. So I wanted to see, is that what's going to happen? And he predicted the citation peak to be, within that range. And I wanted to see, is he right about this? Well, in one sense, he was right, because the peak was there. But what we found is the paper began to be cited a lot later. And part of the reason it began to be cited a lot was because of its role in the revolution. And it wasn't just cited by geologists, because it wasn't being cited for its contribution to geology. It was being cited as an object of study for people in science studies. So in history of science, sociology of science, and philosophy of science, people were looking at the paper, citing it as something worth looking at for that purpose. So this sort of altered its citation trajectory. It made it abnormal. And what I suspect, and this is an empirical question which I'd like to delve into at one point, is that other revolutionary papers have a similar fate. They don't follow the typical citation trajectory of a typical contribution to science, with what Kuhn would call normal science. But what they do is get picked up and cited because they become objects of study because of their role in the revolution. So that's what I found there. That's as part of I do this empirical work in scientometrics, and this is published in the journal Scientometrics. And scientometrics is just the quantitative studies of science. And a lot of the studies are citation studies. But I do that in part to sort of keep my foot in science, like to be doing science. And I always learn a lot when I do those, because you run into sort of methodological problems that scientists are apt to run into.
So essentially, these revolutionary papers, they're cited at first because people are actually literally studying the subject matter of the paper. And then over time, that kind of diverts to people citing it because of what the paper did.
Yeah. And then even in this case, it's now entered a cycle where, like, its 40th anniversary, there'll be a flurry of citations to it, because even geologists will revisit the paper. So they might have a symposium and say, 40 years after Hess's, paper on ocean basins, so they start reflecting on the development of their discipline with respect to that paper. Most contributions in science will never be subjected to such scrutiny or be given such honor. These important papers, they're interesting that way. Now, I want to emphasize I've only completed an empirical study with this revolutionary paper. I've done a similar study I've noted similar data with respect to Einstein's papers. A study I did with Lutz Bornmann, an information scientist. We're looking at citation peaks in philosophy and what papers or books caused citation peaks. And what we found was Einstein's 1905 papers are responsible for a citation peak, which is weird because they're not being cited because of their philosophical insight. They're being cited because they've become objects of study in philosophy of science, that, people study that, that period in the development of physics, and they look at Einstein's papers and they cite them. But they're not citing them and contributing to physics in doing that. They're looking at them as historical artifacts. That's what's happened with the Hess paper as well.
Well, it is a historical artifact.
It is. But I mean, there's many other papers that just, once they've reached their citation peak 5 or 10 years after publication, then, they get the occasional citation every now and then, but they really don't enjoy such revisiting or scrutiny.
And even you, I guess, cite those papers.
Yes, exactly.
So now, so I have some questions on epistemology.
Yeah.
So I've heard the term social epistemology, and you talk about individualistic epistemology, and I want to know what that is and what the difference is between social and individualistic.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'll say, I've been asked a few times to write pieces for handbooks and what have you on social epistemology. And one of the first things I say is it's a very diverse and fragmented field. So there's not a straight answer to your question, which makes it a very good question in a way. What social epistemology is any sort of epistemic. It involves any sort of epistemic study or study of with epistemological relevance that looks at social institutions, social practices, or anything that's non-individualist. For example, entertaining the possibility of collective agency, collective belief, collective rationality. So anytime you sort of go above the level of the individual and the mind and raise an epistemological question, that would be part of social epistemology. So it's a very, very wide-ranging field, and there's a wide array of methods now employed, including historical studies, lab studies, game theory, computer modeling, and what have you. So there's all sorts of ways of studying this stuff. And I think the field is enriched by that, but I also think it's too early to look for some sort of unifying theory or what have you in social epistemology. I'm not even sure that should be an aim. In fact, when I identify my own work in social epistemology, I often qualify it and say, I work in the social epistemology of scientific knowledge. So I emphasize I'm strictly concerned with scientific knowledge, whereas other people, have interests that concern like the public at large, or like there's a lot of work being done on how, responding to the media and learning from the media and what have you, or even Margaret Gilbert's work, some of her work on collective intentionality, where she's talking about small groups forming plural subjects and capable of knowledge, belief in knowledge. She's not so concerned with science, whereas I would say I'm narrowly concerned with science, in part just as that's my research focus.
So yeah, because I know I was looking through some of your papers, and there was one where you were arguing that beliefs form from the individual, and someone else was arguing that no, beliefs form from small groups.
Yeah.
And that doesn't really make sense to me, because it's usually that one eccentric character that comes up with new things, right, that the whole group then believes.
So I'm not quite sure which paper you're referring to. I have engaged in a debate about whether groups are capable of having beliefs that are irreducibly the belief of the group. So, and that's a debate that numerous people are involved in. Margaret Gilbert and Christina Rowland, for example, defend a view where they believe that groups truly believe, that is to say, they are capable of having beliefs that are not reducible to the beliefs of the individual members. I think groups have views that are not reducible to the views of individual members, but I do not believe they're appropriately called beliefs, for reasons that get technical, but they amount to differences between belief and this sort of other notion called acceptance. And I think groups are capable of accepting views, and I'm not the only one in this camp. We're sometimes called rejectionists because we reject that view. I think we should have been called unbelievers, because that's a catchier title. But the basic idea is that we think groups can have beliefs, groups can hold views that are irreducibly the view of the group, but they're more appropriately classified as instances of acceptance, where acceptance involves sort of taking something as true, but it may be for pragmatic reasons. So you can even just accept something you truly don't believe is true. You really don't believe is true, because you're accepting it for the sake of an argument. You're accepting it. In science, for example, you might accept something and pursue it. So Larry Loudon talks about this, taking a stance toward a hypothesis, that you're pursuing a hypothesis. So you accept it and work with it and see where it takes you. So, which doesn't require belief, belief really does involve a conviction that the proposition or view is true. And I think what groups do is not aptly characterized that way. When groups have irreducibly collective beliefs or collective views.
So it's kind of, the Democratic Party or the Republican Party, they have a set beliefs, right? They have written down a certain set of values and, a platform. But the individual who is a part of that group, they will have beliefs that may stray from what the group's beliefs in, but they accept whatever the beliefs are that are foretold by that party.
Yeah. And when they're working as a member of the party, they have obligations to sort of hold forth, or to sort of advance, in a sense, the views of the group as a member of the group. Now, there might be forums in which they can voice their dissent, but it would be very strange if you heard Biden, for example, saying, this is the view of the Democratic Party. I don't accept, or I don't believe it, or I don't accept it. When he's standing up there representing the party, he, in a sense, incurs these obligations. In this sense, my view, to this extent, my view owes a lot to Margaret Gilbert's plural subject view. So I'm very much in line with her view. Where I dissent is when it comes to characterizing what the cognitive state is of the group and the individual in the group that holds these views. She would insist sometimes they're beliefs, and I would insist they're never beliefs. They just involve acceptance. Collective acceptance.
So maybe the key to world peace is getting people to maybe deny their group beliefs a little bit every now and then.
Yeah, I think I'm too modest because of my anti-realism to even guess what the key to world peace is.
So when a group has these beliefs, is that what collective intentionality is?
That's one aspect of collective intentionality. There's many aspects. The part I've focused on is this holding views. I mean, there's collective actions and what have you, but I'm interested in this sort of view holding. And I'm especially interested in the context of, for example, scientific publication, where most, in many fields of science, chemistry, for example, 95% of the articles published are co-authored. Whose view is it? So if you and I publish a paper in chemistry, is it your view? Is it my view? Or is it more aptly described as a view of the collective formed by us working together? And that's my view on the issue, is that it's more aptly characterized that way. Now, the two-person case is not necessarily the typical one. As you make our group larger and larger, it becomes obvious, first of all, that we're going to develop cognitive capacities and knowledge that we individually don't have. So in a sense, views will emerge, call them beliefs for the moment, we'll make inferences based on our pooling our knowledge together that none of us could make on our own. And in that sense, I want to say the fact that we've got these emergent cognitive capacities, emergent views arising in these situations suggests that there's probably an emergent subject whose views these are. Now, each of us individually might adopt the view. Like once we finish writing the paper, you might say, and that's my view too, personally. But you don't have to. And in fact, you might say, well, I agree with 95% of it. There's some of it I don't accept, but I had to sort of go along with it. So that in itself indicates there's something acting on you, sort of bigger than you. Because you're letting your name sort of stand on the paper. It's these very concrete, practical applications of this collective intentionality that I'm interested in science in particular.
Yeah, because I guess when you're writing a paper with someone else, there's a sort of compromise that goes on if you don't really agree with everything that you've written. I mean, that's kind of how it is with any project, right, that you do with someone.
Yes, it is. Yeah. Yeah. And I like Margaret Gilbert gives examples of collective intentionality just involving simple things like two friends walking together. There's a point in which you're acquiescing to things that you as an individual might, there's a certain sense in which you say, well, maybe I would have preferred not to do that. So you decide, do we continue walking together further from my house when I want to go home ultimately, or do I turn us around? But I mean, as a group, we just keep it going. So she thinks it explains a lot of social interaction in general. I'm inclined to think so as well, but that's just not something I've studied with enough care that I want to sort of weigh in a strong sense because of my epistemic caution.
So have you studied anything that's related to that two friends walking along a sidewalk? Do you have anything to say about that?
That one, not really about that one, but I mean, I've had experiences, and I guess I've written in passing remarks and papers related to this about serving on committees. If you've ever served on a committee, there are, at one point, you have to let you have to sort of stand behind the choices of the committee. So you're a member of the committee. You can't then leave the committee room and say, and I disavow it all. You can do that, but then you're really behaving in a very socially deviant way, or like you're sort of stepping out. There might be times where you really should do that, but there's a presumption that when you serve on a committee, you don't do that. So imagine a philosophy department hiring committee, and then they come up with a list of candidates and they leave the room, and then one of the committee members starts phoning other people and saying, that's not, I thought you were better. Like, it would just be absurd that someone would behave like that. Like, they would really be, I mean, there'd be legal problems, but there'd also be the problem of they've really betrayed the committee. They've sat on the committee. There's some sort of norms about how the committee will reach decisions. And then there's a presumption that you'll stand behind these decisions as a collective. So that's an example of collective intentionality, where we operate in these committees. And it happens all the time in our lives. Like, with a committee is a more formal group, but we do it maybe informally as well. You might be going out with a number of friends and sort of deciding what type of restaurant you go to. You probably don't remember going out with friends given this lockdown stuff. So maybe it's been a year since you've been to a restaurant. I don't know. But people used to go to restaurants. That's the sort of thing I have in mind. Yeah.
Are all the restaurants closed in Denmark?
Yeah, they are actually. The restaurants are, except for takeout. So we can't go and have a sit-down meal in a restaurant. And it's been a while since we could. So.
Wow. Yeah, Idaho's a little bit different than most states. The infection rate is really low here. But with that said, I'm not going to speak on the whether or not the restaurant should be closed or not, but that's also kind of a part of that collective intentionality too, in Denmark, right? We're going to close the restaurants because we don't want people to get sick. We don't want the infection rate to spike up and people die, right? So if one restaurant were to deviate from that, that would be strange.
Yes, it would. It would. I mean, we have this, it was just in the news, the BBC, about in France, there was some restaurant found with 100 people in it having dinner without masks and what have you. And it really is like, it's not only sort of wrong because they're having something others can't have, but there is this sort of collective understanding that, this is the way society works. In a way, I'm reminded, like in America, there's a sort of mentality of people feeling sort of more entitlement to decide for themselves. So libertarianism, you might say. Now, there is a similar there is a libertarian strain in Danish society. There's a certain sense when people aren't very judgmental about people's life choices, but there's also here more of an understanding about collective agreements, like, paying taxes. I mean, the way the tax system is run here, I think it would just be extremely difficult to not pay your taxes. It might be impossible, I don't know. But it sort of tax evasion, it would be much harder here than in the United States. But I think there's just even not the sort of will to engage in it in the same way. Like, because people don't see it as an affront or an injustice or an infringement of some sort of liberty or what have you.
I certainly don't. Maybe some types of taxes, maybe I do.
Yeah.
But certainly not taxes in general.
Mm-hmm.
Unless they were up to 50% or something like that.
Yeah. Well, ours probably are.
I guess when you add in all the fees, it kind of, you don't really think of that kind of thing, because in Washington, the next state over, I guess in North Idaho, Washington is the next state over.
Yeah.
But where I am, it's Oregon. But in Washington, there's a lot of fees. All the fees are way higher because they don't have income tax in Washington. But like, for example, getting a driver's license or getting your car registered, all those are maybe 3 times or 4 times more expensive than they are in Idaho. So I guess they get the money out of you no matter what.
Yeah. These things have to be paid for.
Yes. So with all that said, do you have any recent conclusions, any new ideas that you've come up with within the last few, say, couple years?
Well, I'll say we'd like to talk about 2 different streams of research. One is I was engaged in a study with a postdoc on retractions in science. And the first part of the project was merely empirical, collecting data on the rates of retraction in the journal Science. And just to give some perspective, 1 out of every 300 papers in Science is retracted. And then what we've been doing is writing together more philosophical discussions about the inferences to be drawn about the data we found, because it's quite a rich body of data. But the other thing I've been engaged in a lot, so I would like to take an opportunity to just mention it, is I've been doing a lot of research on Thomas Kuhn. So I wrote a book in 2011 on Kuhn's Evolutionary Social Epistemology, which was looking at the relevance of Kuhn's late work for contemporary philosophers of science. And after that time, I began to do more historical work on Kuhn. So looking at, for example, how he came to write structure and the impact of structure on structure of scientific revolutions on intellectuals. Because here's a book that was an academic book that sold over 1 million copies, which is just astounding that a book would sell so much. And I mean, it still sells. I've got a book coming out either late this year or early next year on Kuhn's writing of structure. It's called Kuhn's Intellectual Path, Charting the Structure of Scientific Revolutions. So that'll be coming out with Cambridge University Press. And then related, but distinct from that, is I edited a volume of papers, commissioned papers on Kuhn called Interpreting Kuhn. And that also is with Cambridge University Press. And that is just 12 scholars writing, reflecting on aspects of Kuhn's philosophy of science. I'm very excited about that. That comes out in June. And there's very interesting contributions in the book. So a very interesting paper, for example, by Paul Hoenigan-Huhn, the leading Kuhn scholar on Kuhn's metaphysics. And there's another great paper by Lydia Patton on Kantian dimensions in Kuhn's philosophy. So there's many good things in the book. That's just two examples of what's there.
So Kuhn was an American philosopher, right?
Yes.
And what was his main contributions to philosophy?
Well, what he's most known for is like what in the wider academic culture is the notion of paradigms and paradigm change. And paradigm change and paradigms has been picked up and used by people in many disciplines. I mean, it's even in popular culture. When I was writing the first book on Kuhn, one of the things I noted in it was it's gone from being an analyst term to being I'm blanking on the contrast class. It's now integrated into scientific culture. Scientists use the term paradigm in papers. So an actor, that's it. It's now an actor's term. So the term paradigm is fully integrated into science. And sometimes they use it in the way Kuhn meant it, like as an exemplar, like the most fundamental sense in which he meant it. Now, another way to interpret your question is, what's Kuhn's legacy to philosophy of science? Well, one of the things I argue in the book that's forthcoming is that Kuhn left philosophers with what I call the problem of theory change. What he did was problematize theory change. So he drew it to our attention that it seems to be an inevitable part of the development of scientific knowledge, changes of theory. And real changes of theory involve fundamentally different views of the world. That's a problem. And it's certainly a problem for realists. So I think, like what I argue in the book is the contemporary realism, anti-realism debate, which is focused on the epistemology of science, is a legacy of Kuhn's. Like it's a consequence of Kuhn sort of, in a sense, bringing this problem to our attention and making us feel it's important enough to reflect on and try and address. So I think that's one of his chief contributions to philosophy. And it wasn't what he intended to be his chief contribution, I would say, but that is what he has left us with.
What was his intention?
Well, he wanted to give us, in part, a descriptive account of how science works. And central to his vision was that theoretical knowledge was not, or the growth of science was not strictly cumulative. It wasn't just this story of marching ever closer. He thought you cannot reconcile that with the history of science if you go and read it. So that's what he wanted to leave us with. But he didn't see himself as sort of dumping a problem on philosophers of science. Like, he didn't see himself as sort of creating a problem. But I think that's how it's sort of been, that's the result of what he's published, is that he's created a problem in a way, or he's brought a problem to light. And it's a problem that's interesting and that deserves our attention.
So is a paradigm shift when, say everyone believes the earth is flat, right? And then we evolve all of our beliefs and what we do around the earth being flat. And then some guy comes up and then he measures the angle of the sun or whatever at one point, and then he goes and does that same thing at another point. And then he says, okay, no, the earth is actually round. And then everyone starts believing that. Is that what the paradigm shift is?
Sort of. See, I would want to cast it a different way, like just for the sake of precision, because I think in his later writing, the things he called paradigm changes that most people were focusing on were theory changes. And what he has in mind are fundamental changes in the taxonomy of science. So, or lexical changes, he called them, that violate the no overlap principle. So what he's saying is, think of a taxonomy, a scientific taxonomy, as cutting nature into kinds. And he's saying, when we change theories, we're cutting it in different places, and we're not grouping the same things in the same categories. So with the Copernican revolution, which is one of the easiest examples to illustrate this, the term planet changes its meaning in both senses, both its extension and its intention. So let's just take the extension of the term planet. In Ptolemaic astronomy, the planets were contrasted with the fixed stars, and the planets included the sun, the moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. So those things you can see with the naked eye that deviate from the motion of the fixed stars, which seem to move in 24 hours around us. With the Copernican revolution, they changed what counted as, what was regarded as a planet and what was not. So Copernicus he no longer regarded the sun as a planet. The sun was a star. It was the center of the cosmos. The moon became a satellite of the earth, a type of phenomenon, a kind that didn't exist before. And then the planets now included Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. Now notice Earth has joined the group. Earth wasn't a planet in the Ptolemaic system. It's the center of the cosmos. So what we find is the meaning of planet change, the meaning in that other sense, the intention as well. So the intention of planet in the Ptolemaic theory is a planet is, it's contrasted with the fixed stars. So it's a wandering star. That's the sort of translation of planet. In the Copernican theory, a planet is a satellite of the sun. So the meaning has changed. Now, what obscures the fact that this is so revolutionary is the fact that we still use the same term planet and star and all that, but we don't. We have to realize that they're used in fundamentally different ways. And what Kuhn's suggesting is the things he called paradigm changes or theory changes in structure involve taxonomic changes of this kind. So we have a similar change. I don't want to get into details of this, but when we leave Newton's physics behind, because mass and energy in the new physics are translatable. You can translate mass into energy. You couldn't do that in Newtonian mechanics. So the meaning of the terms have really changed fundamentally. So it's in that sense, we're living and working as scientists in a different world before and after a revolution, because we're cutting it up differently. So we're carving nature at different joints.
And that's what gives us better technology.
It probably does. Or at any rate, with each of these, we seem to be able to advance our technology. But some technological developments, remember, seem to happen quite separate from theoretical understanding. So there's famous cases. I gather there's some group of Inuit in Alaska who have these sort of supremely designed boat, like kayak type boats that are really effective for the water conditions they're used in. And the people who have built these for hundreds of years don't have deep theoretical knowledge about aerodynamics. But somehow through trial and error, they've created a technology that is, if not optimal, at least highly ideal, right? So a lot of technology can happen sort of independent of theoretical developments. But you're right, like as our theoretical understanding advances, it opens up new doors for development of technology. That's for sure.
Or at least with the unobservables, right? Because with the theory of relativity, that's what allows our GPSs to even be accurate at all. Or E equals mc squared, that led to the atomic bomb, nuclear energy.
Yeah.
Things like that. But I don't know. I guess we'll see.
Yes.
So do you have anything else you'd like to say? Leave us off with?
At the moment, I can't think of it, but I want to thank you for the opportunity to have this interview and share some of my philosophy.
Yeah, I really appreciate you doing this. That was very interesting.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. All right, that's Into the Absurd, episode 27 with Dr. K. Brad Wray. Thank you for listening. Goodbye.